During the last long weekend, last week, my family and I were actually able to escape this bunker and were able to get out camping. The first time my 2 year old and 5 year old had been able to actually camp in a tent overnight. We drove down to Numaji National Park, a place that I've been trying to go this entire semester, but haven't been able to make the time to go. Um, it's a really fascinating part of Canberra. After living here for 5 years, I never actually driven down there. Though you can see it pretty much from where I live. It's been a national park since 1984. Um, the traditional owners of the land have been here for 21,000 years or so in the Numaji area. Pastoralist settlers came around the 1830s. Timber extraction started about a century later, and it's where Canberra gets the vast majority of its water. The water table comes from uh, runoff from Numaji National Park. So it's a really cool area and one that I would highly recommend if you're able to take the time and effort. It's still within the ACT and is a pretty easy drive, even for people who have toddlers. It took only about 40 minutes to get to the visitor center, and then we went to camp in Mount Clear campground on the very southern tip of Numaji National Park. And in the drive there, part of the reason why I wanted to go there and how it connects to what I'm going to be talking about today is the charred landscape that we saw on the way to our campground. Uh, Back in the summer, the fires kept on creeping closer and closer to Canberra, and basically the closest large fires that were threatening Canberra were around Tharwa and Numaji National Park down south, and we could see the charred remains of these incredibly huge and fast moving fires. On the drive down, I wasn't actually able to take any pictures of the countryside because I was trying not to plunge us all in a ravine. But it was just this landscape in which you have lush green hillsides coming back in the spring, and on the other side, these charred black trees and empty rolling hills. And when we actually got to the campground itself was nice and green, pretty primitive. Glad we had the four-wheel drive to get down there. Some people here are definitely better at driving on dirt tracks than I am. It's a learning process. But once you actually get to the campground, it's green there, but right across the creek on the side of the campground, it are these kind of burnt hillsides, and it is one of those natural disasters that are of greatest interest and threat to people who live around Canberra and good parts of Australia, and also in California, where I am from. I talking to my family in Southern California in the San Fernando Valley. They can see the fires on the hills. Mount Wilson Observatory, where we used to go on school field trips. One of the, I think it was the place where they first detected black holes decades ago, into Central California, around Paradise, California. I have friends, I have an aunt, uncle, and family who live near Orville, near Paradise, and they've had to be evacuated a couple times during the American summer. And so, natural disasters are real for me. I'm sure they're real for you. Different natural disasters occur in different places, and different people are facing different types of challenges with a changing climate and with the summer coming upon us. I've heard estimates that it's not going to be as dramatic a fire season this year as last, but who knows, right? It's October, a lot can happen, and so I'm really interested in the topics we've read about for this week and that we're going to discuss, both from a self-interested reason to understand where the likely challenges are coming from, how humanity's kind of adapted to either mitigate or adapt to these kind of challenges or just relocate, as well as what what kinds of living arrangements we're going to have to think about as we go forward, right? How are we going to have to change how we build in the part of California where I live? California has statewide regulations having to deal with earthquakes, and so you have adaptation to earthquakes. However, you also see suburbs spreading into the hills that are still subject to fire danger, and so you can adapt to one challenge, but then you also have new ones cropping up that the political institutions and people hadn't really thought about as great of a stretch. So yeah, this topic is real and relevant. I know a lot of students are writing papers on the topic for this semester, as they do every year, and I think it's really crucial to understand how we define a natural disaster, the different types of natural disasters, how they have an effect on various aspects of human security, and directly or indirectly with conflict. And I mentioned fire as a natural disaster risk. Part of the reason why fires are becoming an increased issue here is because of changing rainfall patterns as well as higher temperatures. A couple of months ago, we read a meta analysis of by Sang et al., looking at various parts of rising temperatures and how that could change and affect political violence. Temperatures are also something that we've seen increased. I plotted a graph of the temperature distribution in Canberra, both in the past as well as in the last couple years, and you see this shift in the distribution of temperatures, slightly hotter over the last couple of decades, and why that might not seem that much of a deal. Those extreme temperatures that were either never seen or seen incredibly rarely and not every year have become the new normal. And so you have those 40-degree days becoming a lot more frequent. And the infrastructure is not necessarily adapted to the kind of temperatures we're likely to see in the future. Again, I have a personal experience with this. When my daughter was born a couple of years ago, it was in November, and by January, we had this incredibly hot summer season. I think it was in 2018, and our townhouse had a good air conditioning unit that had served us well for the couple years that we had lived there, and it decided to break on one of those days. It had reached 38 or 39 degrees. So we had an 8-month old at home and a 3 or 4 year old as well, and the temperatures really started to creep up, and we tried different adaptive means. I brought my portable air conditioner from my office and brought it home, but still on the second floor where we slept, we were regularly getting temperatures in the upper 30s within our house in the afternoon, and it made it just impossible to sleep at night. So we ended up having to move to a hotel where they had more reputable air conditioning for basically an 11-day stretch, in which we had 3 or 4 days over 40 degrees and other days in 38, 39 degrees. And so it brought home to me again the fragile nature of the kinds of modern conveniences that we rely on. And I think a lot of people are starting to try to adapt to being able to be prepared for the kind of natural disasters we're likely to face here going forward, but then also in different areas around the world. They're having to make different plans and to adapt to natural disasters that have been happening for millennia. And some of the ones that are of greatest threat, like earthquakes, are not really shaped by human behavior, but the way people interact with the land and the number of people and where they are can end up having negative effects, like with the Fukushima nuclear reactor disaster. You had an offshore earthquake that was the highest people had seen in a century, and a century before, people would die, but the infrastructure they had built around them wasn't as susceptible to the earthquakes, and the amount of power that we had harnessed in nuclear power and the dangers involved didn't exist. And so you see different challenges evolve in different periods, and threats that might be the same for millions of years can be different depending on where people live and how they live. Um, a couple of I didn't know. I thought moving from California that I wouldn't have to worry about earthquakes anymore, but actually, in looking at the types of natural disasters that Australia faces, in 1989 there was a 5.6 on the Richter scale earthquake in Newcastle, New South Wales. 13 people died, 1,000 people were displaced, and over $1 billion in damage. And so you can see earthquakes are relatively rare here, though they do still happen. Now that we're living through a pandemic, which we're going to talk about towards the end of today, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919 also affected Australia quite dramatically. Over roughly 15,000 people died in Australia, and 50 to 100 million people died around the world. Right now, thankfully the impact on Australia has been relatively less with the COVID-19 pandemic, but we're in a very different world now with a different kind of globalized system for moving people and goods infinitely quicker than could be the case in around 1918, 1919, which everything was done by boat. So we're going to look at how these kind of natural disasters, earthquakes, pandemics have affected Australia and the rest of the world. Bushfires are not something that just happened this year. Numaji was also heavily damaged in the 2003 bushfires. Probably until last year, the deadliest bushfire season that I could find was the Black Friday bushfires in Victoria in February of 2009. And bushfires are something, well, not that I have to worry about going back to California during bushfire season, but just my family, the challenges that the U.S. has faced with and just the California bushfires. Over 4 million acres have been destroyed this summer, and they're talking about not just mega fires anymore, but giga fires as all these large fires kind of merge into one. As the climate changes, there's an IMF study that suggests that climate change will bring more frequent kind of natural disasters, which will of course have an effect on economic growth. Different types of natural disasters, of course, are affected by climate change, and others not. Earthquakes, not, but the kind of fires and droughts. I don't know how locusts might be a plague of locusts be affected by climate change. I should look at that. That'd be an interesting research question. So the major kind of the puzzle that motivates me for this week's literature is natural disasters are both unpredictable as well as regular occurrences. They're unpredictable because we're not exactly sure when or how they might happen. But if you live in an earthquake zone, you're going to know at some point you're likely to face an earthquake. And so I think for me, the puzzle is you know they're going to happen, but you're not exactly sure when. Why in the 21st century have we not developed more effective means for preventing, mitigating, or adapting to these kind of disasters? We're going to be talking about a couple of different examples of disasters today, and you can think about to what extent are they regular and predictable occurrences. The Pakistani floods example that I'm going to look at in a second, you have these things happening for decades, if not centuries, right? The government capacity to be able to address these is something we've seen in earlier weeks. I think it's also relevant this week as well. And the other kind of puzzle for me as a conflict scholar is, given the nature of the coronavirus pandemic, why have we not seen more conflict? If the coronavirus has caused more economic uncertainty and scarcity and maybe provided grievances against the governments, there have been ongoing conflicts, and we're going to look at those a bit later, but why haven't we seen more dramatic and widespread conflict, given the unique nature of this crisis in the last 9 months? And that kind of connects to the motivating question for today is, how do natural disasters affect human security and conflict? We've looked at a lot of background kind of geographic and structural conditions over this class so far this semester, and this incredibly is the last of those kind of topics that we're going to be talking about. Next week we're going to look at more in-depth domestic and international responses in week 11 and week 12, but we've started with people, population flows, population dynamics, and then looked at how they move, how that can affect human security and conflict. We looked at how everyone needs to eat and to drink water, and how those resources affected the pressures for conflict. Last week was looking at natural resources, and so I thought I would end with the most kind of sudden trigger and change that could lead to potential human security threats and conflict. So it's an interesting topic. Natural disasters are always popular in movies and shows, and we're living in interesting times in which we are living through a pandemic, which is defined as a natural disaster. And so I thought that's the puzzle. Why haven't we come up with better solutions? And why haven't we seen more conflict than we would expect? What are the causal mechanisms that connect natural disasters to human security and conflict? And how has this evolved over time and changed as population patterns and where people are and the kind of governments that we have changed over time as well. So I would also kind of end this section with our first lecture question, getting your perspective, and I'd be interested to read your thoughts on the Pakistani floods. So there's links to some videos about Pakistani floods. Please watch the Al Jazeera English video about the 2020 floods that have just happened in the last couple months with the monsoon. And the question that I had is, what tensions related to disaster preparedness does this video highlight between the province level government, the Sindh government, and the national level government? So what tensions related to disaster preparedness links the state level government to the national level? Because as we've seen in Australia with the response to the pandemic, as well as with the fires earlier this year, that there are differences between how us as individuals respond, where we live, when we move, and how we respond to these disasters. There's state level, there's local government, state level responses, and federal level. And this is a challenge that not just Australia has to respond to. And so there's been lessons learned this year. The National Cabinet was seen as being a useful way to streamline responses. But these kind of challenges between national and local government, goodness knows you see that in the U.S. in the last couple of years. I thought we should focus on another type of country we haven't seen before. So with the Pakistani example, hopefully it would be interesting to kind of connect natural disaster responses to the kind of political institutions that we've covered in this class. So take a look at that, respond on Waddle, and let's get started. I forgot to add that I also put a couple of additional videos about different natural disasters: the Nepali 2015 earthquake and the Japanese tsunami after the 9.2 on the Richter scale earthquake in 2011. So please watch the videos about the Pakistani earthquakes, the Pakistani floods, the Nepali earthquake, and the Japanese tsunami, so that we have a couple of examples of the size and scale and global impact of these types of natural disasters before we segue into defining our terms and then looking at how they link theoretically to the kind of outcomes we've covered in this class. So, side note, watch those additional videos that I put in Waddle as well as in the YouTube playlist, and then we'll get started with defining our terms with natural disasters. Thanks.